Hey guys, Matt Aaron, the co-host of Blockchain 2025. And I want to give you a bit of a primer on this episode because you should really be excited. This is so fascinating and it's a very futuristic look at something that I believe is inevitable, and that's decentralized prediction markets. Before I explain it a little bit more, it's kind of a hard concept to get your head around. I mean, remember the first time you heard Bitcoin? It's kind of like that. But we explain what it is and the implications of it for the world. And just a very brief intro. There already are prediction markets. Some have been tried, but decentralizing a prediction market and using blockchain does change everything. Just like social networks, right? You have the wisdom of the crowd, these hashtag organizations, as you could call them. Decision-making and predictions can be made by the crowd, and it allows anyone to participate. So if you have knowledge or information in any sector, in any niche in the world, you can profit from that. So imagine a friend and his or her buddy in Cairo, Egypt. They have an idea about the GDP of Egypt for the following year. They can create that market, provide information to people, and make money. That's a really revolutionary concept. Look at the news, journalists having a track record. It's all about wealth from being in the know, rewarding knowledge and creating knowledge for governments and companies, organizations, and people. Here's a fascinating look. What about global warming, protecting natural systems? Could we use prediction markets to protect our climate and environment? Well, Carl Schroeder has the idea of AI, artificial intelligence, being the basis of a prediction system. Using smart sensors, you can measure something like the growth of new trees in a certain area. So if you're interested in seeing an ecosystem flourish, like, hey, let's plant some trees, you can get financial gain from it simply by protecting and fostering it. And we'll go into some other kind of dystopian concepts as well. But yeah, so I just want to prime you to listen, pay attention, and I hope you enjoyed this show. And Kelso is a very knowledgeable co-host, as you'll quickly see.
Welcome to Blockchain 2025. We explore how blockchain technology will affect major industries in the future.
Each episode dissects one industry, how it currently works, why blockchain can disrupt it, and some blockchain projects trying to be the solution.
Blockchain 2025 is part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network. Learn about Bitcoin, create a wallet, and buy your first Satoshis all at Bitcoin.com.
Welcome to Blockchain 2025. This is Matt Aaron.
And this is C. Edward Kelso.
All right, Kelso. This is your first Blockchain 2025 episode, second podcast on the Bitcoin.com podcast network. Excited to have you, man.
Woohoo! Yeah, it's like I said before, I'm a huge fan of all that you're doing. So the fact that I get a chance to mix it up with you here is really cool, and looking very forward to this new season. So awesome. And
it's interesting to have a journalist perspective because you're the first true journalist writer we've had on the show. And not always journalists create podcasters because it's going from writing to audio, but I think you're going to be great, man. I mean, you have a really interesting perspective on things, and just my conversations with you tend to find things that I didn't think about before going into a certain discussion.
Cool. Yeah. It's one of the probably the only, parts of what I do that kind of matters is I'm just saturated by the ecosystem and by all that's going on. So it's kind of nice to have a venue to talk about it and put it in a little bit greater perspective, because you get, as a journalist, especially on the news desk at Bitcoin.com, you're sort of stuck in this myopia where you're just constantly taking information, putting it back out there, and sometimes not considering sort of the broader implications. So I like that I get a chance to do this. So cool.
For sure. And tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself. How long have you been a professional journalist?
I've been in journalism in and out for about 10 years, give or take. I have a kind of a varied background. I was in public education for a while, ran as like a director of operations, gourmet seafood restaurant, kind of done it all in one form or another. My passion has always been economics. I come from sort of the cranky side of capitalist market economics. So I like Ludwig von Mises, Hayek, all those guys, Rothbard, and so on. And then that sort of naturally leads to writing for places like Foundation for Economic Education, Libertarian Institute. There's a whole bunch of them in there. But yeah, I love cryptocurrency, the idea of it, and that I'm making my living in that space. just kind of brings it all together, especially, working for Bitcoin.com. I just couldn't be in a better place, but that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Okay. Well, very cool, man. I wouldn't have guessed the seafood restaurant.
And I don't like seafood on top of everything else.
Oh, man. So, Kelso, well, let's give it a shot here, man.
Go.
What is the topic today?
We're going to hit kind of the buzz of the cryptosphere here, prediction markets. Sometimes they're known as derivatives or futures in kind of a colloquial sense, but kind of how blockchain and the crypto idea works into the history of prediction markets. Betting, if you will.
For sure. So yeah, let's go into part one, which is the history of prediction markets. And just to make sure listeners are clear, a prediction market, think, a sports book, a casino where you can bet on the outcome or result of a game. They have crazy bets on elections. And then the stock market, there's a lot of binary options, basically yes or no, will the price go up or down? Mm-hmm. In 2005, a long time ago, man, Google announced that it had been using prediction markets to forecast product launch dates, new office openings, and many other things of strategic importance. There's also the Hollywood Stock Exchange, a virtual market game established in 1996. Can't believe that.
It's crazy.
And now a division of a different company in which players buy and sell prediction shares of movies, actors, directors, and film-related options. And they're famous because they correctly predicted 32 of 2006's 39 big category Oscar nominees and 7 out of the top 8 category winners.
That's interesting because also, you don't exactly consider the Academy Awards to be a necessarily rational actor. So that shows you that predictive markets can even sort of pivot in that direction when the ultimate body you have to kind of account for. So that's really interesting. I didn't know that.
For sure. And we're going to answer some questions about prediction markets today. First, just the idea of aggregating expert opinion and getting experts there. And number 2, just the incentive structure, being able to participate in a prediction market because you think you have really good information and being rewarded for that.
Yeah. So I'm sure all of us have polled friends on the best movie to see or where to go on vacation or so on. What you normally get is a lot of noise with crowds. And, you can traditionally before predictive markets in the sense that we're speaking of them now, you would have to survey people and there's just tons of noise. There's tons of alternate ideas. And what a price does when you put a metric on it, a price, this communicative device is you take all that information and you squish it into this one little thing. So none of us have time this is the power of prediction markets. None of us have time to survey the entire crowd, listen to everybody's argument back and forth. But now here's a number and it's fluctuating. It's going up or down relative to the eventual reward. And that is super powerful, super efficient. And I think listeners will automatically start doing the math in their head. And wow, well, I don't have to, read everything and I can just look at this price and see it go from there and maybe make better decisions that way. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. And so I think we're going to get into some kind of sci-fi type ideas here in the show. It's quite interesting. Prediction market, you could bet on the 2016 election, Brexit. They were pretty famous where a lot of people were betting on these results. So I want to move on to the blockchain because it's worth noting that all of these prediction markets today are centralized, right? Meaning when it comes to betting on the NFL or NBA or the Premiership League soccer, what happens? It's usually offshore sports books in the Caribbean, like in Antigua. They set the lines, meaning setting the initial odds for a team to win or lose. And then Las Vegas copies them, right? So this is a centralized group of people setting the odds. And they're also the people that determine the winner, right?
That's right.
They will, based on whoever wins the game, whether that's ESPN or NBA.com, they choose the winner.
So that's a really great point. Centralization, that's the dirty word that we want to kind of stay away from because having a central focus, a person in charge is right away a bit of a danger because you have to trust that person. So, your mom is doing something as simple as playing poker or whatever, and the site asks for, say, $100 to get in. Provably fair. We have all these different ways of trying to evaluate online gambling, for example. But what happens if that particular group or service is compromised in some way?
Okay, so Kelso, give me a concrete example of how betting on a basketball game with a centralized source, a consumer, could be affected.
Right. Well, just traditionally, we can see that they've gotten, as elaborate as getting players to actually throw games. to we have the Pete Rose scandal in the United States on baseball, where, again, you have these central points of failure. And so for the average consumer who's, looking to wager, again, it sounds trivial. It sounds like, well, who cares? I mean, you're just betting money on a stupid baseball game or basketball game. But think it through all the way. That's your money, and you're laying it down because you believe on the other side they're honest actors. Maybe there's a better way to perform that transaction. So you want to bet on the game without the minder, without a person who can be corrupted. And again, as I started to say, I guess, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when that's going to happen. And we're hoping, the theory is that when you decentralize that idea, so you have multiple spots on people kind of checking each other, and the way the blockchain works on the Bitcoin core network, for example, it's much, much more difficult, and some people say impossible, to employ censorship of a kind. So whether that's through corruption or just the basic idea of having points shaved off of your money.
For sure. So the whole idea, and I've bet a lot on sports, as we mentioned in our gambling episode, but the whole idea, there's a huge incentive to sometimes the difference between 6 and 7 points can mean a lot. Money, 1 point can mean so much money. But if it's decentralized, in theory, then we'll talk about it soon, you have these market makers, but anyone can create a market, and it's a decentralized network. No one can influence that way.
Right.
And this will happen with prediction markets, whether they're centralized or decentralized. But in a kind of dystopian world, Kelso, what if I could create a market saying that I bet that there will be an oil spill by 2021? And maybe there's enough money in this decentralized prediction market. There's people in real life that are betting on that. They have the financial incentive to want to create this oil spill, something that would be negative for mankind because of this bet that's been laid out there.
Right. Like, who's to say, right, that these predictive markets will, work in this morally compatible way that we've imagined them? That's a really good point, actually. Why couldn't you? Because then you create this perverse incentive. It goes back to maybe our pre-show talk here when we were kind of fleshing this out a bit. I think markets, by definition, they're the sum of human choices. I think they assume that people are good, that people are essentially, now again, good is a loaded word, and I totally get that. But I'm going to assume that you and I know what that means in a kind of a rough sense. So, yeah, I mean, you could get somebody up there who says, let's blow up the world, or, that's for sure. That's certainly a possibility. I don't think in the ultimate sense that it would be supported. And I do think when people consider markets, and again, this is a kind of a revolutionary way. So we're starting with the trivial. We're starting with, like betting on baseball and basketball and so on. And then we're going to oil slicks. But ultimately, we're talking about a system of governance here. We're talking about a way that humans will organize society in one sense or another. And people, I think people tend to take that pretty seriously. So decentralized prediction markets will allow more people to participate ultimately in how things shake out. And sort of the underlying assumption there, the idea is that more people having a crack at an idea, kind of checking each other as we go along, is preferable, is better than having, say, one person in charge.
Okay, so what would be a prediction market where you could see that taking place?
We can imagine it in a bunch of different ways, but as you've explained with sports and so on, I think right away maybe a large decision. So say an entitlement program, whether people wanted to participate in it or not, you could predict, you can basically set a market and saying, I think that universal basic income will happen at this time and in this way and for this amount of money, which would be, say, again, I'm going pro-welfare state here. So you'd make the market, you would set it based on however you would determine that price, and then essentially give it a time limit, months or days or whatever, an election, and then people could then wager on whether or not they would want to see that happen. So it's almost an immediate way to get opinions back, but also, as we discussed before with the noisy idea, without people shouting at each other in the literal sense, or just having to take in all this various information on, whether welfare is good or bad or entitlements. You could, as the consumer of this product, you can just see, well, yeah, no, that's not going to work, or it will, and so on.
But Kelso, are you betting on what you want to happen or what you think will happen? There's two different things there, right?
Yeah, and exactly. And that's the tension that exists in all of these markets. Because there are some people, right, who will wager just on the probability that they're going to be paid off. And there are other people that will wager on the actual substance of the issue. So they'll actually, want this to occur, whatever it is, the election of Donald Trump, the outcome of this particular entitlement program, their vested interest, they will want this to happen, or they will not want it to happen and will, then sort of bid the price down, as it were.
And there is something to be said that if it looks less likely that's going to happen, that has a strong effect on the actual result, right? So if they see it's only a 10% chance of happening, it can actually help persuade people to continue not to vote for it because it seems so unlikely. If there's a weird psychological thing, I'm not sure if I explained that well, happening in that.
For sure. You've kind of touched on what John Maynard Keynes, kind of a mid-20th century English economist, called animal spirits. He meant it in a negative sense, but also there's maybe we asked about the dystopian idea of, someone setting dangers up and people wanting that to occur because of their, wanting to cash in on that danger or that terrorist act or whatever. In this way, animal spirits work against it. So there's sort of a double whammy there. So you see all these people moving out of that particular position. You go, yeah, it's not going to happen. So it almost doesn't matter whether you want it to happen if enough people are, again, as I explained off show here, they're left with their decent impulses. We do believe that they will go in what most people would consider the right direction. But yeah, exactly. It will kind of all fall on itself is sort of the idea.
So Kelso, I think like the whole idea of blockchain, right? There are prediction markets right now, but they're a lot of private prediction markets. But having all of this information there, I would think insurance companies, a lot of insurance is based on world events and natural disasters and economies collapsing, right?
Heck yeah.
Having an open platform where all this data is here, insurance companies could be really big for them to see this type of information, right? Mm-hmm. But Kelso, let's go into the third part. Some projects that are trying to create these decentralized prediction marketplaces. And there are two right now, Augur and Gnosis, which are pretty similar. And I must admit, they are very complex. They haven't fully launched yet. So I'm going to try to stay as basic as possible based on my own ignorance. But I think the intention of Augur is, like we said, be a decentralized prediction market, right? And Gnosis thinks a little bit more, of course, on the decentralized predictions, but they're more focused, I think, on that hive mind and predictive intelligence. Those are their intentions, but they have a lot of similar features. Mm-hmm. And we'll see how they play out. Both have very sharp and smart teams. And they support three types of events, right? So you have binary outcomes, yes or no. Categorical, for example, who will win the election, you can between 5 categories. Mm-hmm. And then scalar, S-C-A-L-A-R, I don't know how to pronounce that, but you have a upper and lower boundary. Just think of it this way. It's like the Apple stock price, will it be above or below X number, and there's a boundary of results there that you can pay for results.
If people are listening and they're kind of hearing us struggle with this idea, that's on purpose. We're not coming at this as super experts. We're sort of groping around, as most people are, to try to figure out how this is going to work. But right off the bat, I think there might be a problem here when it comes to governance, because let's say that Augur and Gnosis, as we've determined them, are fairly similar. What if they take on the same issue, but come up with different answers, say in the government sense? Like, how does that shake out? So do we need a third arbiter? And then also when you're talking about the scalar idea of lower and upper boundary ideas, and you used Apple, which I thought was a pretty good example, stock price. Is there a chance at arbitrage there, or am I going too far down the rabbit hole?
Well, hey man, I think it's worth going down the rabbit hole, because just like Bitcoin when it was a white paper, or even 2009, 2010, mm-hmm. It's impossible to predict things until they actually hit the free market and people use the platforms. But let me mention two things that may be relevant to this. So both of these platforms, one is you can be a market maker, right? Meaning that I could, unlike the centralized sports book in Antigua, I, Matt Aaron, could say, I want to bet on the harvest of apples in Poland in 2022, and I can set the market. And I get a reward for setting that market. Mm-hmm. So I like the idea of you can use it to, go ahead.
Is there a barrier to entry in this? Sorry. You, Matt Aaron, all you need is just access to a computer, right? And whatever. So are there barriers here that we're envisioning? So you don't have to be an expert.
Sure.
You just have to be able to make some sort of prediction, right?
That's right. But you do need the tokens, right? So you do have to stake a certain amount of tokens. In Augur, it's rep or reputation, which is pretty interesting. And then Gnosis is GNO. They're both built on top of Ethereum. So a lot of similarities here. And so you have to stake these tokens, meaning that you have to provide some, I guess, liquidity to the market. And the other way to get involved is being an oracle. An oracle is someone who stakes their tokens, meaning they bet their tokens that, let's just say the score of the basketball game was X, Y, and Z. And you build your reputation. You get rewarded tokens for choosing what the majority by making the right decision. The right decision in this case being what the majority decides is correct. So hopefully over time, you have this crowd wisdom of oracles. So not relying on ESPN.com per se for the result of a sports event, but what everyone says happened. And that should be accurate going forward. Keyword should.
Should. That's really interesting. And my point in mentioning the barriers to entry or onboarding is that this is just the same as Bitcoin. It's a radical idea that anybody, again, what we've said is the entry points, anybody can do this. I mean, that changes probably literally everything. As this idea sort of spreads, man, I think it's so powerful that we're displacing officialdom. These guys are kind of pushing out legacy experts, people who have credentials. And so we believe them because they wear the right uniform or they have a white jacket or they, well, I'm Larry Kudlow and I've been on television for 35 years. Now we have a way to sort of keep track of them, but also to keep them honest in that other people can eat their lunch, can basically get on and usurp them.
For sure. And that's really interesting, Kelso. So the whole idea of, hey, I have some really interesting information. I feel like I'm the expert, even though I don't have the uniform.
Right.
And I believe that the Bulgarian economy is going to default in 2024. And I can put some very high odds out there. Be like, this guy thinks he's crazy. Well, we'll place a bet out there. And it comes to skin in the game. It's easy to say you believe in something, but if you don't want to bet on it, do you really believe this? And so it allows the real experts, I would say, to come out. And that's where I want to pose a question to you, Kelso. With journalists, bloggers, some of it is just presenting facts or information, but a lot of it is opinions on what's going to happen, what's likely to happen. Using a blockchain and a ledger of predictions, would it be interesting in certain situations for journalists to, in their op-ed piece, to say, and I bet this will happen, I'm staking some tokens on this, and being able to look at an economist, someone who writes for the Financial Times, and to look at the predictions for some for CNBC especially, right? Look at the predictions over a long period of time and kind of evaluate how accurate they've done, and with a clear financial reward for being correct or incorrect over time. And I think that could potentially show how good someone is.
Yeah. And I'll just put it right out there because I hadn't thought of this until you brought it up to me. And I'm sort of embarrassed to say that. But yes, the state of financial journalism, fintech, or whatever you want to call it, it sucks, man. It's awful. You really don't know who you're reading or why exactly you should pay attention to them. And again, this probably goes doubly for me. When people read my stuff, they'll come back to me often and they'll say, well, what about this, that, and the other thing? I have skin in the game in terms of my professional reputation, but if I go on and please the right people, the incentives are all perverse. So as long as I'm being paid and the person has enough money, I can sort of pump out as much garbage as that person's pocketbook will allow. But put me in a competitive market where and it doesn't have to be financial journalism, by the way. This is all journalism. And again, I think most of our listeners will probably be nodding at this point. Journalism is just in a terrible, terrible state, especially the professional end of it, the so-called professional end of it. And I think that's a broader metaphor for what we're talking about in really all areas of life. We have these people who set themselves up as experts, and we really don't know. Again, they don't have to predict anything, just getting the basic facts right. And if you can reward, or I guess punish is maybe a little too harsh of a word, but if you can reward or Darwinianly punish them in a prediction market, yeah, you're going to change. I know I'd be a lot more careful. I mean, I'm careful now, but I mean, I'd certainly go, ooh, well, let me double check this fact. Let me go back and look at this again. So yeah, no, it would definitely have a radical influence on my profession, but also technically this is how everybody gets their information, through a media source of some kind. So yeah, I would definitely, just as a reader, as a consumer of say video or podcast or written news, I would definitely go over to prediction markets and kind of see what these guys and gals are doing. Yeah, that's a really, really interesting proposition.
For sure. Look at The Economist, how well they predicted policies and we'll say the real world over the last 10 years. And it's because who's the best economist? It's a really tough question to answer, right? It's usually more an emotional answer. Especially, I think a lot of people listening, being able to disprove
almost always
your least favorite journalist or economist and say, listen, you've been repeatedly wrong over the last 5 years. you may work for the New York Times. Paul Krugman, right?
Paul Krugman, we're talking about you, punk. Hope you're listening.
Yeah, Paul Krugman. Yeah, he has a pretty good reputation in a lot of people, but he's been wrong.
Nobel Prize.
He's got a Nobel Prize, right? And then so you could look at Nobel Prize winners who have repeatedly been wrong in their predictions and flawed in their analysis. I think that could really improve journalism.
Yeah.
This is Jeffrey Tucker of the American Institute for Economic Research and the founder of the Atlanta Bitcoin Embassy. Make sure to listen to the Humans of Bitcoin podcast, part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network. Stories from people around the world whose lives have been changed by Bitcoin. New episodes every Tuesday.
Oh, man. And this guy, what did he say? He predicted the internet would just, kind of peter out in a couple of years and go the way of the fax machine. Please. Yeah, this guy's been a joke for way too long. But anyway, not to pick on Paul Krugman, which I will take every opportunity to do. But the idea is the emperor in most cases is just butt naked. And it's hard to see that because, again, people in nice suits, they're on kind of an exclusive broadcast. They tend to have access to power, and they get access to power because they don't challenge it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's just journalism. So you can imagine what's going on in the financial industry. You can imagine what's going on in politics in general, science. This spreads out to everything. And so, yeah, this is why I tried to, in the beginning, caution listeners that this is not about betting on basketball. And it's cool. It's cool. Like, totally with you on it. And it's a lot of fun. And especially when you're watching a game, to have $100 or $1,000 on LeBron James, you're definitely skinning the game there. But there is a much, much deeper implication for really impactful segments of our society.
And Kelso, think of it this way, man. The epidemics, right? Disease outbreak. There's been some studies about predictive markets being the best way for predicting and hence preventing disease outbreaks, right? So it's like, hey, I think malaria is coming back to Kentucky or something. I don't know. I mean, that's not the best example there. But, looking at public health experts being able to predict things, I think I'm all about putting your money where your mouth is and incentivizing people to become experts. And I define expert not by your title, not by how nice your tie and suit is, but how accurate you are in predicting the way things shape out, having skin in the game.
Underline, underscore, bold, italicized, 72 font, those last couple of sentences. That's the difference. That is the difference. We're changing, or this market could conceivably change what we consider to be an expert, a professional, and official.
For sure. And here's what I say. I'm not sure if Gnosis or Augur will work. I'm rooting for both of them. I think it's very obvious that these are highly intelligent people. I can't even imagine how you would program these platforms to work. So kudos to them for trying to tackle such a technically complicated problem. But I think it can have a real big use case for the world.
Oh, for sure. And a mild shout out here to the guy that started me off on thinking about this was Paul Stortz of the HiveMind project, formerly TruthCoin. Again, these guys are credible eggheads. And I'm lucky to be in the same, paragraph, much less room with these guys. So yeah, this is big, big stuff. And I really want to see how it shakes out.
And then so Kelso, man, this was a fun first episode. I think we could even come back to prediction markets once Gnosis and Augur or other platforms or HiveMind get a little bit more developed. I guess you could say that about every blockchain project. And what are we covering next week?
I have been enthralled with this idea of using blockchain to facilitate religion, and in particular, how that works with sacred documents, loosely the priesthood. And I had never thought about it before and kind of bumped into it, and we'll get into it next time. But religion and the blockchain, we're going to blow your mind next week.
For sure. All right. Well, thanks so much. And listeners, as always, subscribe, leave a review, share, spread the word. Really appreciate it. And thanks a lot, Kelso. I'll see you next week, man.
Yeah, man. Take it easy.
How do you prefer your crypto news? If it's through your headphones, then you'll love this podcast. This Week in Bitcoin is an easy-to-digest news summary published every Friday with a length of 15 minutes or less. Subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Bitcoin.com podcast network.
Thanks for listening to the Bitcoin.com podcast network. To learn more about our shows, visit Bitcoin.com/podcast. Bitcoin.com podcast network.